of our two-part online lectures discussing artwork produced during the Roman Empire. This lecture is going to concentrate on later art production for the most part, in the High and Late Empire periods. And I say for the most part because there are a couple of early empire images that I have at the beginning of the presentation. But for the most part, we are looking at the later pieces of the High and Late Empire periods. Now, before we look at art, I just want to point out a couple things really quick. Things I think that would be helpful to keep in the back of your mind as you look at the artwork. The High Empire period was the height of the Roman Empire. This is the time that Rome was the most powerful, the most wealthiest, and had its largest amount of territorial expansion. And this map does date to the High Empire period, so you can see just how expansive the empire really was. Also keep in mind the Late Empire period. This is the time when Rome was in decline. The Colosseum, the very famous Colosseum, which is in many ways emblematic of ancient Rome itself. The Colosseum was built under the oversight of the Flavian dynasty. It was a short-lived dynasty of 3 rulers, but it was a dynasty that was considered by historians to be very successful. And we see here one of the architectural triumphs that this dynasty could claim. The incredibly amazing Colosseum, which we can see is an elaboration of the amphitheater form. Now, we initially looked at the amphitheater form in the first part of the lecture when we were looking at the amphitheater that was constructed in Pompeii. The amphitheater in Pompeii could seat approximately 20,000 people. The amphitheater here, the Colosseum, could seat 50,000. So this is almost twice the size, or a little more than twice the size, of the Pompeii amphitheater. Now, the Colosseum originally was known as the Flavian Amphitheater. It was not originally known as the Colosseum. The reason why it was known as the Colosseum is because when it was built, there was right next to it originally a Colossus statue of the Emperor Nero. Colossus basically just means large statue. How large was this statue? It was approximately 10 stories tall. To give you an idea of size, it was about the same size as the Statue of Liberty. So extremely large statue. And this statue depicted Nero very heroic, very nude, with a crown that was evocative of the crown that was worn by the sun god Sol. This time-honored strategy, which we've seen it again and again, even in the Roman Empire, think back to Augustus and his breastplate and the sculpture Augustus Primaporta, of linking the god with the ruler as a way to bolster the ruler's political power. Nero's doing it as well. Now, this is not the only connection that the Colosseum has with the Emperor Nero. There also is a very important connection that has to do with the location of the Colosseum. The Colosseum wasn't just randomly built in any old available place in Rome. The site of the Colosseum actually is very specific, and it's incredibly important to part of the meaning and the function of the structure. The Colosseum is built on the site that was formerly a palace that belonged to Nero. Now, what happened was when Nero was in charge of Rome as the emperor, there was a fire that destroyed a lot of Rome. And this fire was in prime real estate, the central area of Rome. And Nero said, oh, hey, all of a sudden there's this vacant land created by this fire. I'm going to build myself a palace. And it wasn't just any old palace. This palace was ridiculous. It was ridiculous in terms of size, and it was ridiculous in terms of the level of luxury. It was known as the Golden Palace. It had golden ceilings and things like that. This didn't sit so well with the people of Rome, that not only did he take this land that was Roman land, civic land, he builds this ridiculous palace, living in the lap of luxury, right in the face of everybody. Well, eventually, not surprisingly, Nero falls from grace, and with that, we have the dismantling of the palace, the Colosseum built in its place. Now, you can see the message that this could be communicating, this idea that the Flavians are giving this land that was perceived to be stolen by Nero back to the Romans. And they give it back to the Romans by giving them this incredible structure for them to go to be entertained. And by the way, the entertainment was free. So this was truly entertainment that was available to all Romans. The Romans very much appreciated this. To celebrate the opening of the Colosseum, to much expense to the emperor, but very, very good investment politically, the emperor paid for 100 consecutive days of entertainment. And at the end of the 100 consecutive days, it culminated with a mock military battle where they flooded the arena and had ships fighting. They were able to do this because the Colosseum had been located on an artificial lake that was part of Nero's palace. So they were able to do the drainage and the irrigation, no problem. This aerial view shows what the Colosseum looked like. This was the arena. Now, thankfully, the arena no longer exists. And I say thankfully because underneath we can see the substructure of the Colosseum, which is also an important component of the overall structure. Important because you can see that the substructure consists of a series of passageways, of rooms that were like the holding areas for the animals and for the people that participated in combat. Do you remember that movie Gladiator? That super awesome movie with Russell Crowe in it? That movie actually does a pretty good job of showing how the Colosseum operated. They have scenes in the movie that take place in the substructure, so you can get an idea of the rooms, the passageways, but they also show the pulley system that brought animals up to the arena floor and other ways in which the participants were able to access the arena. I recommend, after watching this or listening to this lecture, to watch this movie again to kind of see the history versus the Hollywood interpretation. Super good movie, except it is a lot of bit violent. So here we have the Colosseum exterior that I just wanted to show you a close-up of really quick. I wanted to show you a close-up of this exterior because you can see here that down this floor, this is where all of the entrances were located. And it's hard to see in this particular image, but some of the entrances were numbered. And they were numbered to function kind of as crowd control. Because, like the Pompeii Amphitheater, the Colosseum also was seated according to hierarchy. If you've got 50,000 people, though, that are coming in to view entertainment, it needs to be a bit more organized. So the numbered entrances were based on where people would enter based on their hierarchy. They would go in and sit, and so while they are being entertained, they are simultaneously looking at views of hierarchy. The triumphal arch. The triumphal arch is actually a form of architecture that is distinctly Roman. This is not a copy or an import from Greece. It's a truly distinct Roman type of architecture that has a very long-standing history in the empire. We see the earliest triumphal arches being built as early as the 2nd century BCE, and they're built all the way through to the fall of the empire. Now, with this long history, we do see subtle changes that happen in the triumphal arch over time. One thing, though, that really never changes is the shape of the arch. That you can see it's basically this like rectangular shape with the archway cut through. That stays the same. The other thing that always stays the same is the function. The function is commemoration. Now, with the name triumphal arch, you might assume that that function is commemorating military victory, and most often it was. But we also can see, and I have an example to show you, of some more mundane reasons why a triumphal arch would be built, to pretty much just celebrate anything. Now, the Arch of Titus is an example of a very early triumphal arch. And you can see at the outset that the triumphal arches are rather plain, in that they're very limited in sculpture. The sculpture, in fact, is limited to the interior of the archway, which unfortunately is shadowed here, so we can't see it. We also see sculpture in this region here. These are called the spandrels. and then up in here. And you should all know what this is. The frieze. So this is the limits of the sculpture. We have some Corinthian columns, 2 of which flank the archway here. Here's some people to give you a sense of scale. They're rather large, the triumphal arch, to convey power. Now the other significant thing is up on the top here. The top portion of the triumphal arch is called the attic. We have text here, and the text basically is saying that this arch is dedicated to the god Titus. So what happened was, if the emperor had a good relationship with the people, and more importantly, a good relationship with the Senate, they would, after the emperor passes away, name them a god. If they were someone like Nero, who everybody hated, they would just destroy the artwork associated with the emperor and pretend like they didn't exist. Okay, the High Empire period, looking at the column of Trajan. Trajan was an incredibly important emperor of the High Empire period, the second emperor in the High Empire period, but very important because he was very successful militarily. He really is credited with bringing in a lot of wealth and a lot of territory to the empire. Because he brought in so much money, he used a lot of his money for incredible architectural projects throughout Rome. I'm not going to go into them here, but you can read about them in your textbook. And just think about the size and the expense and how this would impart upon the people of Rome. Now, the column of Trajan actually is Trajan's tomb. In the bottom part here, this is where Trajan was laid to rest, and then he has this giant column that sits upon his tomb. And what's incredible about this column is its adornment, in that it is completely covered with a spiral, continuous narrative frieze. Okay, so spiral, it's spiraling up. Frieze, it's a band of sculpture. Continuous narrative. So we know narrative means story. Continuous means that this story is told in one compositional space. In fact, 625 feet of space. So if you took this frieze off the column, if you rolled it out, it would be one long composition that measured 620 feet, 25 feet. This is incredible. There is no work of art prior to this column that features such an extensive continuous narrative. So it makes this work very groundbreaking. It also makes this work very influential because we see after many works of art that also feature extensive continuous narratives. Because we don't see this prior to the column of Trajan, we can assume that they are using the column of Trajan as an influence. We will see this in this class when we get to the Middle Ages. So huge continuous narrative. And then at the top, originally there was this very heroic and again nude image of Trajan. Now in the Middle Ages it was seen as being vulgar to have this nude sculpture out in public, and so it was replaced with a sculpture of St. Peter. So this is not a sculpture that's part of the original monument. Now, the continuous narrative frieze is detailing 2 of Trajan's most successful military battles. So we can see that because this is his tomb, he really wants to be remembered in this military context. So we have 2 of Trajan's most successful military campaigns. Now, this is told in more than 150 episodes, depicting more than 2,500 figures. Regardless of anything, in every scene, Trajan is always the compositional focus. Trajan, of course, built himself an arch. Now we can see, if you compare this to the Arch of Titus, that there's been some development in the triumphal arch form. Namely, which we can all see, is that there is a lot more sculpture. Sculpture actually is covering every part of the arch, including up here into the attic. And here we have our text that's glorifying the accomplishments of Trajan, so we know that he was a popular emperor in the history of Rome, one that was very much respected and well loved. Now this arch was built to commemorate a road that Trajan had built. And also, I think, to just simply commemorate how awesome Trajan was as an emperor, in his opinion. All of these images here were used to advertise how great Trajan was. In many ways, it acted like this modern-day billboard, these images of propaganda. It shows, of course, Trajan being victorious with the military, but also shows kind of the softer side of Trajan, showing him doing things like passing out food to poor children. Now, he probably did not really do that while he was emperor of Rome, but he was trying to kind of appeal to people that not only was he this really successful military leader, but that he also cared about the people of Rome as well. The other thing that's really important is it also shows Trajan hanging out with the gods, in the direct company of the gods. This was something that Roman emperors had not done before in their official imagery up to this point. Brilliant move on the part of Trajan, if you think about it. So he is of such power and status that he hangs out with the gods. They spend time together on the weekends. And it again is meant to show his power. This proved to be so successful in terms of political imagery that after this point, the subsequent emperors of Rome follow suit and also create official imagery showing their close relation to the gods. And then we get to the Pantheon, the most important structure ever built. The Pantheon was a temple that was in dedication of all the gods, Pantheon. Now, why would I say such a bold claim that this is the most important structure ever built? And when it comes down to it, the answer is influence. There is a combination of architectural features, the rotunda and the portico. The rotunda is this round structure in the back, the round temple type, which we know isn't new. We know that Rome imported these round temple types from Greece at the outset. But what's new is the combination of the portico, a porch. So super emphasized entryway. This combination of the round structure with a clearly emphasized entryway was not really truly seen before prior to the construction of the Pantheon, but is incredibly common. And in fact, most every single rotunda structure that's built subsequently in some way features an influence coming from the Pantheon. We do not see any other structure in the history of art that can claim this level of influence, even today. Commit this image to memory, and you will find, after taking this class, structure after structure after structure that bears the influence of the Pantheon, and you will see that I am right. Now, let's take a look at the inside, which this is a painting. I like to use this painting because it's the most clear kind of thing, the most clear kind of image that you can see that that shows the interior of the Pantheon. And it's hard to get clear images because of the interesting light that's inside of the structure. And that interesting light comes from the fact that the Pantheon has an oculus, a hole in the ceiling. The hole in the ceiling, the oculus, was there as a way to allow people to directly commune to the gods, that they can send up their prayers and their dedications to the gods, and there's this sort of direct passageway that allows for the gods to receive them, a more sort of direct interaction. The other thing, though, about the oculus that I think is significant is it actually does affect the feel of the interior and the experience of the interior. It lets in this natural light that changes over time. Like over here in this painting, there's a cloudy sky. It's going to impact the quality of light. The light will be different if there's completely cloudy skies, or if there's no clouds in the sky, or if it's sunrise or sunset or in the height of the afternoon. So the light is constantly changing and shifting in ways that create this almost sort of mysterious interior that really does heighten the sensation of being in there, and I would imagine would heighten the religious experience. The oculus is located in the dome, the hemispherical ceiling that we see up here. Very often, and this certainly becomes a focus in Christian architecture, the dome is viewed as the space of the heavens. So it makes sense that you would have the oculus as like the kind of portal. The dome sits on the drum, which is the base. Now this dome is significant because it spans the largest unsupported freestanding interior space in the world. Remember talking about this when we talked about the Mycenaeans and we talked about the Tholos, the treasury of Atreus? This is the structure that now takes this accolade of the largest interior space that is freestanding, Pantheon. And what makes this possible? The advent of concrete, which, as we know, was invented by the Romans. Now, part of what makes this dome possible to span this space and still retain its structural integrity, part of that is the coffering. The coffering are the recessed square shapes that we see here. Now, part of this is decorative, to just simply give the Pantheon this kind of decorative interior, but it's functional as well. Removes material from the dome to make it lighter. And before I move on, you might be wondering, well, what happens when it rains? When it happens when it rains is nothing. It just rains and then the rain drains out. I personally think it would be super interesting to be at the interior of this structure when it's raining, to experience being indoors, but also being rained on at the same time. The Pantheon is an incredible structure. Marcus Aurelius, also, like Trajan, one of the most celebrated emperors in Rome's history. And here we have an equestrian statue. These are also sometimes called equestrian portraits, which is basically a portrait of somebody on a horse. Now, why would this be something that someone would want to do, to create an image of themselves on a horse? Well, horses convey power. And part of that you can see in the fact that he effortlessly guides this horse. Now, the horse originally had reins, right? But look at how loosely he holds his reins. So here's this huge, powerful animal that he just controls through his presence. Barely hangs on to the reins, doesn't even have a saddle. No problem. The horse can also be an element of status. The horse can also be a reference to military leadership, which is definitely something that Marcus Aurelius was successful at. So he's cruising around on this horse, no problem controlling it, and he has his arm extended out. Do you remember what this represents? Speaking, gesture, right? So he's either speaking to his people or to the military. Doesn't matter who it really is, because pretty much the message is the same thing. Now, recent evidence indicates that perhaps this may not have been a gesture of speaking, but a gesture of mercy. That originally there could have been a captive below down in here begging for mercy, and Marcus Aurelius is granting that, to show not only that he's a powerful ruler, but that he's also a benevolent one as well. We see that Marcus Aurelius is bearded. Beard is a common symbol to indicate age. So we do see that in the High Empire period that we have emperors showing age and wisdom. And this is something that Marcus Aurelius would be okay with, because he was actually very astute intellectually. He wrote a lot. He was a very accomplished writer. And so he would have been okay being seen as older and wise, part of his intellectualism, which people actually really respected about him. And in fact, people liked Marcus Aurelius so much that the beard became very much in vogue. And you see during this time, pretty much every man who could recorded in art with a beard. And that beard is because Marcus Aurelius made them so fashionable. Material also is significant. We have bronze, right, which is to convey strength, power, wealth, permanence. And then finally, size. Look at the size of Marcus Aurelius compared to the size of the horse. Do you think that Marcus Aurelius was riding around on a pony? No, he was riding on a full-size, large horse. This is some hierarchical scale going on. They're enlarging the size of Marcus Aurelius to make him appear almost superhuman, that he's almost godlike. And of course, that is a strategy to first and foremost convey power. Remember the movie The Gladiator? I just want to point this out to give you some insight into the political transitions that are happening at this moment in the Roman Empire. So the beginning of the movie, that old guy, that was Marcus Aurelius. And Marcus Aurelius' son was Commodus, the bad guy. Now, there's no historical evidence that indicates that there was ever someone of this character, Maximus, if I think his name was, if I remember right. There was no Gladiator Maximus, and there certainly was no Gladiator, well, he wasn't a gladiator at the time that Marcus Aurelius was going to pass his power down to. So we don't know if that's accurate, but Commodus was the son, and I just put this in there. This is an example of Commodus and an image that he commissioned for art. He fancied himself as Hercules, and so he has the lion skin and the club and all of that sort of thing. Now, not to give anything away, because obviously Commodus is no longer alive at this day and age, Commodus eventually dies. Okay. Now, what happens is when Commodus dies, he does not have, and by the way that he dies in the Gladiator is not historically accurate. I'm not going to say how, but in case you haven't seen it, but the way he dies is not historically accurate. Once he dies, though, there is no heir to take over for him. He doesn't have a son. And so this plunges Rome once again into this time of uncertainty. And in the end, we have Septimius Severus that's able to come in and to take control over Rome. And he ushers in the late Empire period. So this is Septimius Severus here, and he was an African-born general. Now, a lot of people actually were kind of questioning this. Like, who is this guy? Like, why does he get to take over Rome? And so what Severus did was he told people that he was the son of Marcus Aurelius. And the way that he tried to legitimize that claim is by having this beard. Marcus Aurelius has a beard, Severus has a beard. Can't you see the family resemblance? That kind of thing. Now, you can see in the beard, and I'm not going to point at it because that annoying box keeps coming up, that there's gray in the beard. And so he even, in his images, is allowing for and embracing the depiction of age. Now, this is a portrait of Severus, and what's interesting is that the majority of his images actually were family portraits, which is very, very rare for the time period. Now, despite all of the portraits he commissioned, this is one of the few that remain. And I like this portrait because it gives us some insight, not only into how emperors depicted themselves, aged and wise, but also kind of the situation that's going on here that explains in part why we see the decline of that empire. So when Severus passes away, we get to Caracalla, his son. That's who power passes to. One of the first things that Caracalla does as emperor is he kills his brother Geta because he sees his brother as a threat to his power. And then he goes in and he just erases the image of Geta, pretending hopefully that this person never existed. This shows the kind of person that is ruling over Rome. Now, is this the first emperor to behave badly? No. We have Nero, we have the very famous Caligula, who supposedly nominated a horse to be a member of the Senate, or one of his advisors. But these type of corrupt individuals begin to rule over Rome more and more frequently. And then we have the Arch of Constantine. This arch represents the latest development in the triumphal arch form. Now, Constantine's a very important person in the history of Rome. He was Rome's first Christian emperor. So Constantine, he came into power. He actually beat out his political rivals to take control of Rome. And one of the things that he did is he legalized Christianity, which he did in the year 313 with the Edict of Milan. Edict of Milan allowed for religious tolerance, and it legalized Christianity. We're going to talk more about Constantine when we talk about early Christian architecture. Now, to celebrate his rise to power, he builds this triumphal arch. Now, you can see that the most obvious difference is that the size of the triumphal arch has increased. And by the way, this is what stands now next to the Colosseum. So if you go to the Colosseum in Rome, you'll see this right next to it. Larger in size by having 3 archways rather than the typical one. Otherwise, it's all pretty much the same, with sculpture covering all areas. Except we now have the incorporation of sculpture in the round, as well as relief sculpture up in the attic. Now, the interesting thing about Constantine and this arch is the way in which it was constructed. Constantine told the people building this arch to go out and to take from well-known arches, particularly the arches of Marcus Aurelius, Trajan, and Hadrian, to take images off of their arch, to take off the head of the emperor and put Constantine's head on and then stick it on the arch. So some people argue, okay, he did this because he wanted to sort of integrate himself within the history of Rome. He wanted to associate himself with all of these much loved and celebrated emperors to show that he was next in line. And this does seem like a pretty likely agenda. Other people argue, and I agree with this as well, is that this is evidence of the decline of Rome, that they no longer have the resources to train artists to create new works of art. And so instead what's happening is they're engaging in a practice known as spolia, where they're taking pre-existing artwork and incorporating it into new artwork. Again, perhaps because they don't have the resources at this point to invest into artwork. We're going to end with one more work associated with Constantine, the Portrait of Constantine. And I wanted to show you this because in many ways we've gone full circle. You'll notice that in the representation of Constantine seen here, that he is shown as youthful. We don't have the beard any longer. He goes back to the ways in which emperors are represented as seen with Augustus, eternally youthful. The other thing I think is very interesting about the sculpture is the sheer size of it. We're looking at the head of Constantine. Look at the size, 8 feet 6 inches. This is the head. The head is 8 feet 6 inches. The statue altogether, 40 feet. 40 feet. 4 times 40. Here is the bicep, the kneecap, the hand. Unfortunately, this is all that remains. And this concludes our study of ancient Roman artwork.